This is a guide to making a pair of bespoke trousers with a button fly start to finish. It is better if you have a firm knowledge of making bespoke trousers anyway, as I'm going to be glossing over a lot of what is done the same way as when making a zip fly, but for clarity, there will be a lot of repeated information. I go over this guide in 3 basic steps. First, the preparation, then making the trousers up for a fitting or a baste, if you will, and then how they would be finished, how the finished garment would be made. The fitting stage can be completely left out, since the fitting and finishing stage both start from the same preparation stage, basically. There are no shortage of ways to make a button fly. This is just the way I happen to prefer at the moment. I will only go over my method, which is the first I learned. I find it to be the neatest and cleanest that I've seen, and of which I've used approximately twice. I think this is my second button fly. Some finer points are outlined in an illustrated guide that I may just overlay on the screen if I can't get the PDF in the description. Interestingly, in the old days before zip flies, when normal suiting was practically the equivalent of today's overcoating fabric, the buttons wouldn't have an impression through the cloth, but these days, with much lighter cloth, it's possible that the buttons leave an impression pressing on today's finer cloth, much in the same way that jeans do as they fade in, leaving impressions of the buttons on the front. This is just a potential consideration. This is just a potential consideration when making button flies, and which method you may like to use. To start, the fly and bearer are both cut in the normal way. Both the typical shapes that would be used when making a zip fly in whatever style. Both need their accompanying silicia, the fly to bind the edge and the bearer to finish it later. The fly needs additional pieces of silicia cut the same shape as that the cloth is cut. Cut it on the double. One pair needs to be cut for the baste and the other pair needs to be cut for the finish. Cut the linen or fusing like normal that will go onto both. Usually I have the binding and silicia bearer and the bearer's silicia pre-cut. That is all that is different in the trimming. Just the extra 4 pieces of silicia cut the same shape of the fly. Since the fly and bearer are being stiffened with linen, that is what is being fastened on first, instead of ironing some fusing on. Making the fly for the baste, I am taking a pair of the fly silicia and from the notch sewing a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. back tack at the notch, and the stitch is sewn all the way up the cloth. Making the fly for the finish is almost the same, but using the fly and one of the other pieces of silesia, placing them right sides together and sewing from the notch again, this time using a small 1 cm 3/8 seam allowance. For both flies, snip the cloth to the stitching, but with the cloth fly, the fabric and linen should be snipped down to the whole centimeter, the 3/8 at the notch. Pressing the silesia fly, the seam may as well be pressed open so that it can be folded over with the seam inside of the notch, and below the notch the edges need to be folded outside, so that leaves it with a step where the fork notch is. Similar on the finished fly, though press the silesia over the seam before folding the main over so that the silesia becomes hidden behind the cloth of the fold. The edge of the fly could be bound at this point as well, but I prefer to bind the button flies at the end when I'm finished. When applying the fly and the bearer to the trouser, they go on the same sides as normal, and when it's done, very similarly to normal as well, only without a zip. The final piece of silesia that was cut to the shape of the fly is being sewn onto the trouser instead of the cloth fly piece. Lining up the notch as normal, it is sewn with the width of a small seam allowance up to 1 cm 3/8 below the waistline mark stitches. The bearer also goes on the trouser, and it is also sewn with a seam allowance all the way up the trouser. Press the seam allowance on the bearer side open and snip the seam allowance at the notch down to the stitching. On the fly, pressing the silesia over before folding and pressing the edge of the trouser over the whole seam allowance. This is just to illustrate how the button fly will sit on the trouser. it is applied when finishing the fly after the seat seam has been sewn. At this moment though, it is worth finding the button placements. So with the notch on the fly lined up to the notch on the trouser, copy the mark stitches onto the top of the fly and mark a seam below it. The lowest button I want 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch above the notch. The top button I want about 3 centimeters or 1.25 inches below the seam that was marked. Placing the buttons is quite subjective, this is just the placement that I am using at the moment. The buttons between the top and bottom should be around 3.5 to 4.5 centimeters or 1.5 to 1.75 inches apart, and there are normally 3 to 5 buttons. Finding the distance between the top and the bottom button, it can be easy to place them quite evenly. I end up with 5 total buttonholes on the baste with the height of this fly. The holes should be at least 1 centimeter, 3/8 from the edge of the fly, and they are 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 wide, based on the size of the buttons. The button location would be marked on the finished fly, and the buttonholes could be sewn if this were being made to finish at this moment. But if the height of the fly changes after the fitting, then it might not fit if the finished fly were made and used now. Otherwise, the trouser is prepared, and I will go over making the fly for the baste first, and then the finish will be practically from this same point. Sewing the outleg, waistband, inseam and seat seam are the same and not involved in making a button fly trouser specifically. That is where this trouser has been sewn until where the fly is being made and prepared for a fitting. Pressing the fly open on the seat seam, this pair of trousers has a brace backs, but that doesn't have any effect on the fly either. Again, this is just to illustrate how the finished fly will go onto the trouser. With the trouser laying flat, preferably on a sleeve board, the baste fly with the holes cut open for the buttons will go on the sleisha at the front edge. The notch will go between the piece of sleisha sewn onto the top side and the bearer. The button stand needs to sit slightly away from the edge of the trouser so that it doesn't show when the trousers are being worn. The fly needs to be basted in place by the J-stitch, so it should be pinned to the trouser, and the trouser should be flipped right side up to draw and sew the stitch into the trouser. To find where the buttons need to go on the bearer, just go to the front needs to be placed together as it will be when it's closed, and the trouser can be folded away to find where the front of the buttonholes are, and that's where the buttons need to be. The top of the fly needs to be tacked down, but that will practically happen by default when the hooks and bars go on. That is the button fly made to fit. In some cases, the maker doesn't make a fake fly or put buttons on it to close it. They just baste the final fly on without sewing buttonholes into it. The hooks and the bar close the trousers, and it's just tried on like that. It works, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's much more simple to explain without showing, so I've shown this method to make with a fake fly. Essentially from the same point as before, just at the finishing stage. The pockets have been sewn in, and the waistband is in its final position, just before sewing the seat seam, marking the final positions of the buttonholes. 3 centimeters, 1 1/4 inch from the waistband seam, 2.5 centimeters, 1 inch from the notch, and the buttons between them should be around 3.5 to 4.5 centimeters, or 1.5 to 1 3/4 inches apart. Finding the distance between the top and the bottom buttons can be easy to place them quite evenly. Again, this is just exactly the same as it was finding the button placement on the basted fly. The waistband had to be lowered in this case, so there are 4 buttonholes now. The holes should be at least 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch from the edge of the fly, and they are 1.5 centimeters wide or 5/8 of an inch wide, because of the size of the buttons. I find it much easier to sew the buttonholes onto the fly before the fly is sewn into the trouser, so this is what I do. I'm not going to go over sewing buttonholes here, but in trousers you typically don't use a gimp because it gets too stiff. The top of the buttonholes are on the cloth and the back of the buttonholes are in the silicea. Just ahead of making up the fly, I want to contextualize it by sewing the seat seam, chalking the seat seam onto the left leg, just like should be normal. Just the seam allowance on the top side, and then following the mark stitches on the underside, joining the 2 across the inseam inlay. Removing all the related mark stitches before machining the seat. Starting to machine the stitch is a very normal affair. Beyond that, it's very simple anyway. Pulling the legs right side out, placing the fork notches together, and checking that the length of the flies are equal. Placing the edges of the cloth together, the fly and bearer should be out of the way and not caught in the stitch. Without having a zip here makes this a bit easier. Ensuring the bottom of the flies are firmly tacked at the fork notch. Sewing the seat seam, I skipped over most of it and back down to the fork where the stitch was started. I just wanted to clearly show snipping the right hand side's trouser seam allowance to the top of the seat seam. It's a good snip to make that allows the seat seam to sit more neatly, and it shouldn't be done when making the baste because it can cause a point of weakness in the trouser. After the fly is finished, it is so heavily reinforced that the snip or the weak point doesn't particularly matter, doesn't have an effect. Plus doing a final check that the waistbands line up at the top of the fly. When the seat seam is pressed open, the fly needs to be put into position, with the buttonholes sewn in or not. Placing it so that the step is where the seam of the fly was sewn from the inside of the trouser at the fork notch, where the seat seam is sewn from. When I make the button fly, I prefer to bind the fly itself to the silicea that was sewn onto the trouser in the beginning. When I've mostly seen button flies, the original silicea is not sewn to the button stand. The button stand is bound with the silesia like it normally is, and then it's just placed on top of the silesia sewn to the trouser. The silesia on the trouser is cut so that it doesn't show past the button stand, and its edge is often pinking sheared or overlocked to inhibit it from fraying. Either way, the J-stitch is almost all that's actually holding the fly in place. I prefer the method of binding them together at this moment. To bind them together, first positioning the fly and pinning it to the silesia. The edge needs to be cut down so that all the layers are even and level with the cloth, most importantly. The binding then goes onto all of the layers just like normal, just with the added detail of all the layers being attached to the trouser already. Essentially, next is typical lining of the trousers, starting with placing the curtain underneath the fly and the pocket before basting the J-stitch. Realistically, the front edge should have been basted before the J-stitch. When basting the front edge, just only don't sew through the fly. Only make sure the edge and the silesia are positioned properly, and then the fly itself would be in a more reliable position to baste the J-stitch. At this moment, finishing the bearer, drawing on the shape to sew along. This is done more in depth in trouser making and samples, or it will be. Before the subsequent stitches to finish the bottom edges of the fly and reinforcing the stitch of the fork, the fly should be basted closed. As it is, it won't be reliably closed. If the stitches are done without the fly being closed properly, then the stitches might be in the wrong places. If they're in the wrong places, then the fly will end up distorted until the stitches are taken out and put back properly. And the stitches are not made to be taken out properly, so it can be a tiresome affair. Overall though, this specific way of finishing the fly is my way of doing it. I've derived it from a few methods that I've seen, so the fly can be finished in any way. This is just me finishing the fly my way. The last stitch around the fly, except for sewing on the waistband, is to sew down the curtain and sew the bearer silesia in the seam. Firstly, again positioning the curtain underneath the silesia in the pocket. In the between time, finishing some other unrelated parts of the trouser before taking it back to the machine to sew the last bearer stitch. Without the zip, it requires a little more care to try and sew exactly between the seams, plus changing the thread in the bobbin to match the silicea as applicable. With more of the unrelated parts of the trouser made, then the buttons should be marked onto the bearer, closing the hook and bar to ensure the buttons and the hooks will work together. Lay the trouser flat and pull the cloth and silicea out of the way without moving the fly itself, dropping chalk dust through the holes. Or that's one way. There are numerous ways it could be done. The first part to finish is normal. The fly needs to be tacked down to the waistband. This helps to secure it on top, and the waistband lining can then be sewn down to the top of the fly. The stitch tacking the fly needs to be quite tough, sewing it to the seam allowance of the waistband, as with the rest of the waistband lining. The J-stitch can be started without tying off this thread and starting a new one, so long as the stitch is firmly started at the waistband. It's like I can use the same piece of thread. The J-stitch is sewn and finished at the base of the trouser fly like normal, creating a bar tack and ending with the stitch inside of the trouser under the bearer's silicea. The waistband lining can be sewn at whatever point. The only other relevant finishing is the left center front, tacking the seam between the waistband and the center front. This stitch is only on the fold of the cloth like it is normally. The button fly should not be sewn down with this stitch. Bar tacking and finishing the stitch on the inside, and then I go on to finish the bottom of the bearer in my normal way. The buttons can go on at any point in the finishing, probably after the top press, just where they were marked on beforehand. The last part of the finishing could be to bar tack the open edges of the fly between each button to the front edge of the trouser. This will help keep the edge from flapping open at all and keeping the buttons covered. I often see this in trousers, but I'm aware that in jeans the tacks between the buttons can be bothersome. So I do not sew the fly to the trouser between each button at this moment. After I wear this trouser for some time, I may change my mind and decide that it is better to tack the fly down the front as well. Otherwise, these trousers need a really good top press, and the last mark stitch is removed and they are done.